My husband of 20 years died. Suddenly, I just found out. He had a secret second family. The entire time, I don't even know where to begin. My world has shattered. My husband, David, M45, died 3 weeks ago. A sudden heart attack. One moment he was there, laughing, making breakfast for our kids, and the next, gone. We'd been married for 20 years. We met in college, fell in love, and built a life together. We had 2 wonderful children, Emily, F17, and Tom, M15. We had a good life, or so I thought. David was a software engineer. He worked hard, provided for us. He was a loving father, a devoted husband, or so I thought. The first few weeks after his death were a blur. Funeral arrangements, grief counseling, trying to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. I was numb, operating on autopilot. Last week I started going through David's things. It was incredibly painful, but it had to be done. I needed to sort through his paperwork, his clothes, his personal belongings. That's when I found it. A small, locked box, hidden at the back of our closet, behind a stack of old photo albums. I'd never seen it before. I found the key in his desk drawer. Inside the box were documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, photographs, letters. They told a story I couldn't comprehend, a story of a second life, a secret family. David had been married before, not divorced, married. He had another wife, Susan, F42, and 2 children, Olivia, F18, and Jack, M16, living in a city about 3 hours away. He'd been living this double life for our entire marriage, 22 years, 2 families, 2 homes, 2 sets of children, 2 wives who had no idea the other existed. The documents were meticulous. He had detailed records of both families' finances, schedules, birthdays, anniversaries. He'd created an elaborate system to keep his 2 lives separate, to juggle his time between 2 homes. The photographs were gut-wrenching. Pictures of David with Susan and their children, smiling, laughing, celebrating holidays, going on vacations. Pictures of a life that mirrored my own, but with different people. The letters were the worst. Letters from Susan expressing her love for him, her gratitude for his support, her excitement about their future together. Letters from his other children, talking about school, friends, their dreams. I sat there, on the floor of our closet, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. For hours, I cried, I screamed, I threw things. I felt like I was going to be sick. How could he do this? How could he live this lie for so long? How could he betray me, our children, so completely? I haven't told anyone yet. Not my family, not my friends, not even my therapist. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to even begin to process it. I feel like I'm drowning in a sea of grief, anger, and disbelief. I feel like I've lost not only my husband, but my entire past, my entire reality. I don't know what to do. Do I contact this other woman? Do I tell our children? Do I hire a lawyer? Do I just disappear? I need advice. I need help. I feel so alone. Update 1. It's been a week since I discovered David's secret life. A week of sleepless nights, endless tears, and agonizing decisions. After reading all your comments on my original post, thank you from the bottom of my shattered heart, I decided I needed to contact Susan, his other wife. I couldn't keep this a secret any longer. I needed to know the truth, the whole truth, and I felt in some twisted way that she deserved to know too. Finding her wasn't difficult. David had her address, phone number, and email address in the locked box. He'd even kept a detailed calendar of his visits to her, meticulously tracking his time between our 2 families. It was chilling to see how organized, how calculated his deception had been. I decided to write her a letter. I felt like a phone call would be too abrupt, too overwhelming. I needed to give her time to process the information, to prepare herself. Writing the letter was the hardest thing I've ever done. I struggled to find the right words, to convey the enormity of the situation without sounding accusatory or hysterical. I kept it simple. I introduced myself, explained that David had died, and said that I'd discovered something shocking that she needed to know. I told her that I had proof, documents, and photographs. I said that I wasn't looking for a fight, that I just needed to understand. I gave her my phone number and email address, and I asked her to contact me when she was ready. I mailed the letter on Monday. I spent the next few days in a state of agonizing suspense, jumping at every phone call, every email notification. On Thursday, I received a phone call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, but something told me I had to. It was Susan. Her voice was shaky, hesitant. She said she'd received my letter, that she was in shock. that she didn't know what to believe. We talked for over an hour. It was the most surreal, most painful conversation of my life. We shared our stories, our memories of David. We compared timelines, piecing together the fragments of his double life. It was like looking into a distorted mirror. Her life with David paralleled my own, almost exactly. He'd used the same excuses for his absences, the same lies, the same manipulations. He told her that he worked in software sales, that his job required frequent travel. He told her that he had to spend weeks away from home for business trips. He'd even used the same cover stories, conferences, client meetings, training seminars. The only difference was that she believed him. She had no reason to doubt him. She told me that she'd met David at a trade show, that they'd fallen in love quickly, that he'd seemed like the perfect man. She said he was charming, attentive, and generous. He'd showered her with gifts, taken her on romantic getaways, made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. She said she'd always wondered why he hadn't proposed, why they hadn't officially gotten married. He'd always had an excuse. He was waiting for the right time. He wanted to save up for a big wedding. He had some family issues he needed to resolve first. It was a lie, and it seems the marriage certificate I found was forged or something. I'll get into that in another update. She'd believed him. She'd trusted him. As we talked, I realized that Susan wasn't my enemy. She was a victim, just like me. She'd been manipulated, deceived, betrayed, just like me. We cried together, on the phone, two strangers united by a shared grief, a shared trauma. She told me about her children, Olivia, F18, and Jack, M16. She said they were devastated by their father's death. They had no idea about me, about my children, about David's double life. I told her about Emily, F17, and Tom, M15. I told her how much they loved their father, how much they were hurting. We agreed to meet in person with our children. We decided that they deserved to know the truth, to meet their half-siblings. It's going to be incredibly difficult, incredibly painful, but we both feel it's the right thing to do. We're meeting next week at a neutral location, a park halfway between our two cities. I'm terrified. I don't know what to expect. I don't know how our children will react, but I know I'm not alone. I have Susan, a woman I never knew existed until a week ago, but who now feels like the only person in the world who truly understands what I'm going through. I'll update again after the meeting. Thank you again for your continued support. It means everything to me. Update 2. The days leading up to the meeting felt like an eternity. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, replaced by a constant loop of anxiety and what-ifs. My mind raced, conjuring up every possible scenario, each more daunting than the last. How would Susan be in person? Would our children connect, clash, or simply stare at each other in bewildered silence? I'd spoken to Emily and Tom, preparing them as best as I could without overwhelming them. The initial shock of their father's double life had given way to a numb acceptance, punctuated by bursts of anger and confusion. They were understandably apprehensive about meeting Susan and their half-siblings. Dr. Ramirez, their therapist, had been invaluable, helping them process their emotions and equipping them with coping mechanisms. She'd even offered to be present at the meeting, but we decided to try it on our own first. The chosen location was a sprawling park, halfway between our cities. It offered open spaces, picnic tables, and a sense of neutrality. I arrived early with Emily and Tom, my heart pounding in my chest. The weather was overcast, a fitting reflection of the somber mood. Susan arrived shortly after with Olivia and Jack. The moment we saw each other, it was like looking into a fractured mirror. Susan was a petite woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile that didn't quite reach them. Olivia, her daughter, was a striking contrast. Tall, with David's dark hair and intense gaze. Jack, the younger one, seemed withdrawn, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the ground. The initial introductions were awkward, stilted. We exchanged polite greetings, our voices barely above a whisper. The children mostly stared at each other, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension in their eyes. We settled at a picnic table, a vast expanse of wood separating us, a physical manifestation of the chasm that had opened up in our lives. Susan and I tried to break the ice, talking about the weather, the drive, anything to avoid the gaping wound that lay between us. It was Emily, my brave, outspoken daughter, who finally broke the silence. "So," she said, looking directly at Olivia, "you're our sister?" Olivia met her gaze, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Half-sister," she corrected, her voice tight. "We have the same father, The word father hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Tom, my usually quiet son, surprised me by speaking up. "Did you know?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Did you know about us?" Jack, Susan's son, finally lifted his head. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We didn't know anything. He told us he was working, traveling. He was always gone." A wave of shared grief washed over us. We were all victims of David's lies, his carefully constructed facade. Susan reached across the table and took my hand. Her touch was surprisingly comforting. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice choking with tears. "I'm so sorry for all of this." I squeezed her hand, tears welling up in my own eyes. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry too." And in that moment, something shifted. The anger, the resentment, the blame, it didn't disappear entirely, but it softened, replaced by a fragile sense of shared understanding. We were two women, bound together by a tragedy we didn't create, trying to navigate a reality we never asked for. The children started talking, tentatively at first. Then, with growing ease, they discovered shared interests. A love for the same music, a passion for video games, a surprisingly similar sense of humor. They compared stories about their father, realizing how he'd told them the same jokes, used the same phrases, and played the same games with them. It was both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. We spent several hours at the park, talking, crying, and even laughing occasionally. We shared photos, memories, and the shattered remnants of our lives. We didn't solve anything. We didn't erase the pain, but we created a connection, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of shared loss and betrayal. As the sun began to set, we said our goodbyes. It was awkward, uncertain. We didn't know what the future held, but we knew we weren't alone. And "We should do this again," Susan said, as we walked towards our cars. "Yes," I agreed. "We should." Driving home, I felt a sense of peace. Not happiness, not yet, but a quiet sense of resolution. The meeting hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. It was the first step towards healing, towards rebuilding our lives. Not as they were, but as they could be. The children were quiet in the back seat, lost in their own thoughts. As we pulled into our driveway, Emily turned to me. "Mom," she said, I think I'm glad we met them." And in that moment, I knew we'd made the right decision. We'd faced the darkness together, and we'd found a flicker of light. Update 3. The relative peace I felt after meeting Susan and her children was, predictably, short-lived. The legal and financial ramifications of David's double life were looming, a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. First, there was the will. David's will, the one he'd filed with our lawyer years ago, left everything to me and our children. It made no mention of Susan, Olivia, or Jack. This, in itself, wasn't surprising, given his elaborate deception. However, Susan informed me that David had told her he'd created a separate will, leaving a portion of his assets to her and their children. He'd even shown her a copy years ago, but she hadn't seen it since. He'd claimed it was safely stored with his lawyer in Susan's city. This was a new layer of complexity. If a second will existed, it could potentially invalidate the one I had, throwing the entire estate into legal limbo. I contacted our lawyer, Mr. Henderson, and relayed Susan's information. He was skeptical, but he agreed to investigate. He contacted the lawyer David had supposedly used in Susan's city. The lawyer denied ever having drafted a will for David. Another lie, another layer of deception. Mr. Henderson then advised me to thoroughly search David's belongings, including his office at home, which I'd barely touched since his death, and any storage units he might have rented. The search of David's home office was disturbing. I found more evidence of his double life, meticulously organized and hidden. He had separate computers, separate phones, even separate sets of clothes for his two lives. It was like unearthing the lair of a secret agent, a man living a carefully constructed lie. I found no will, but I did find something else. In a locked drawer beneath a stack of old tax returns, I found a small notebook. It was a journal of sorts, filled with David's handwriting. The entries were chilling. He wrote about his two families, his two lives. He described the thrill of the deception, the challenge of keeping his secrets. He wrote about his feelings for Susan and me, but they weren't expressions of love. They were assessments. He compared us, weighed our pros and cons, like we were commodities, not people. He wrote about his children, too, but again, there was a disturbing detachment. He seemed more interested in their accomplishments, their achievements, than in their actual well-being. He saw them as extensions of himself, reflections of his own success. And then there were the entries about the money. He'd been siphoning money from our joint accounts for years, diverting it into secret accounts in his name only. He'd been using these funds to support his second family, to pay for their house, their cars, their vacations. He'd also been investing in high-risk ventures, hoping to make a quick fortune. He'd lost a significant amount of money, but he'd hidden it from both me and Susan. The journal was a window into a mind I didn't recognize, a mind filled with deceit, manipulation, and a chilling lack of empathy. I handed the journal over to Mr. Henderson. He said it was damning evidence, not only of David's character but also of his intent to defraud both me and Susan. The legal battle is just beginning. Susan and I, despite the initial shock and pain, have decided to work together. We've hired a lawyer to represent both of our interests and the interests of our children. We're challenging the validity of the original will, arguing that it was based on fraud and deceit. We're also seeking to recover the funds David had secretly diverted to his other family and the money he'd lost through his reckless investments. It's going to be a long, messy, and emotionally draining process, but we're determined to fight for what's rightfully ours and for what's rightfully our children's. The children are coping in their own ways. Emily and Tom have started talking to Olivia and Jack regularly, texting, video chatting, even planning a visit during the summer. They're building a bond, a sibling relationship that was stolen from them for years. I'm still struggling. The anger, the grief, the betrayal. It's a constant battle, but I'm also starting to feel a sense of empowerment. I'm no longer a victim. I'm a survivor, and I'm fighting back. I'll update again when there are further developments. Thank you, as always, for your unwavering support. It means the world to me. Update 4. I thought discovering the second family was the end, the climax of this horrendous story, but it seems my late husband was a connoisseur of secrets. It's been about 2 months since the last update, and the legal battles continue. But that's not the focus of this update. This is about another bomb that dropped, one I never saw coming. After the initial shock of meeting Susan and the kids, and the subsequent legal wrangling over the will, I thought I'd plumbed the depths of David's deception. I was wrong. It started with a seemingly innocuous email. It was from a woman I'd never heard of, Patricia. The subject line simply read, "David." My heart sank. I almost deleted it, thinking it was another attempt by Clara, from my first story attempt, to weasel her way back in, or a relative of my husband with complaints. But something, a morbid curiosity perhaps, made me open it. The email was short, hesitant, and heartbreaking. Patricia introduced herself as a friend of David's, a close friend. She said she'd known about me, about our children, but that David had told her we were separated, that he was planning to divorce me. She'd found out about his death through a mutual acquaintance. Apparently, David had a whole network of friends I knew nothing about. She'd been devastated, confused, and then she'd stumbled upon my original Reddit post. She recognized the details, the timeline, the names. She realized that David had been lying to her too. She attached a photograph. It was a picture of David, smiling, his arm around Patricia. They looked happy. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Another woman, another lie. I replied to the email, cautiously. I asked her how long she'd known David, what their relationship had been. Her response was devastating. They'd been together for 5 years. He'd told her he loved her, that he wanted to marry her, that he was just waiting for the right time to leave me. He'd even introduced her to his friends, the same friends who attended our barbecues, our children's birthday parties, our holiday gatherings. These friends, my friends, had known about Patricia. They'd covered for David, lied to my face, for years. I felt a new wave of betrayal, a deeper, more visceral pain. It wasn't just David. It was an entire network of people who had enabled his deception, who had participated in his lies. I met with Patricia a week later. She was different from Susan and me. Younger, maybe in her early 30s, with a vibrant, outgoing personality. She was a successful artist, independent, confident. She told me their story. They'd met at an art gallery opening. He'd pursued her relentlessly, showering her with compliments, gifts, and attention. He'd told her he was unhappily married, that he was planning to leave me as soon as the children were older. She'd believed him. She'd fallen in love with him. She showed me text messages, emails, and photographs. They were intimate, passionate. They revealed a side of David I'd never seen, or perhaps had chosen not to see. She also told me something else, something that made my blood run cold. She said David had been planning to leave me. He'd told her he was going to ask for a divorce just a few weeks before he died. He'd even shown her a draft of a separation agreement he'd supposedly drawn up. This was a new level of cruelty. He hadn't just been living a double life. He'd been planning to discard me, to replace me with another woman. I felt a surge of anger, so intense it almost took my breath away. I wanted to scream, to rage, to destroy something, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. For years, I'd blamed myself for David's unhappiness. I'd wondered what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed him. Now I realized it wasn't about me, it was about him. He was a serial deceiver, a manipulator, a man incapable of genuine connection or empathy. I shared this new information with Mr. Henderson, my lawyer. He said it could have significant implications for the legal case. It strengthened our argument that David had acted with premeditation and malice, that he had intentionally defrauded both me and Susan. The legal battles continue. The emotional toll is immense, but I'm starting to see a path forward. I'm starting to understand that I wasn't responsible for David's choices, that I wasn't to blame for his betrayal. I'm learning to let go of the guilt, the self-doubt, the what-ifs. I'm focusing on my children, on my healing, on building a new life, a life free from lies and deception. I'll update again when there's more news. Thank you, as always, for your support. It means the world to me. Update 5. It's been 6 months since my last update, and I believe this will be the final chapter of this incredibly painful saga. There have been developments, some expected, others not so much. First, the legal front, the lawsuit against David's estate, and by extension Susan, as she was technically a beneficiary, though an unwitting one, concluded. It was a grueling process, emotionally draining for everyone involved. The evidence, bolstered by David's journal and Patricia's testimony, was overwhelming. The court ruled in our favor. The original will, the one leaving everything to me and my children, was deemed valid. The judge ruled that David's attempts to create a second will were fraudulent, and that his actions constituted a deliberate attempt to disinherit his legal family. Susan and her children were awarded a small settlement, a fraction of what David had promised them, but enough to help them get back on their feet. It wasn't what they'd hoped for, but they understood the circumstances. We've maintained a civil, even friendly, relationship. The children continue to see each other, and Susan and I have found a strange sort of camaraderie in our shared experience. Patricia, however, received nothing. The court ruled that she had no legal claim to David's estate. As they were never married, she was devastated, but she understood. She's focusing on her art, on rebuilding her life. We've stayed in touch, offering each other support and understanding. The financial settlement was significant, but it wasn't about the money. It was about justice, about holding David accountable for his actions, even in death. Now, for the twist. A few weeks ago, I received a package in the mail. It was from a law firm in a small town I'd never heard of. Inside was a letter and a small wooden box. The letter explained that the box had been found in a safety deposit box belonging to David. The safety deposit box had been rented under a false name, but the bank had eventually traced it back to his estate. The letter instructed me to open the box only in the presence of a witness. I called Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, and we opened the box together in his office. Inside were several items: a handwritten letter addressed to me, a photograph of a young woman I'd never seen before, a birth certificate for a child, a boy, born 25 years ago, a DNA test. The letter was from David. It was dated just a week before his death. In the letter, he confessed to another secret. He'd had a child, a son, before he met me. He'd never told me about him. He'd never acknowledged him publicly. He'd provided some financial support, anonymously, but he'd never been a father to him. He wrote that he'd always regretted his decision, that he'd been too cowardly to face the consequences of his actions. He said he'd been planning to tell me, to finally come clean, but he'd run out of time. The DNA test confirmed that the child, Michael, M25, was David's son. I was stunned, speechless. Another secret, another betrayal, another life I knew nothing about. But this time the betrayal felt different. It wasn't directed at me, not personally. It was a betrayal of his son, a son he'd abandoned, a son he'd never known. I contacted Michael through the law firm. It was awkward, painful, but also necessary. He was understandably angry, resentful. He'd grown up without a father, wondering why he'd been abandoned. We met in person a few weeks ago. He's a good man, kind, intelligent, and compassionate. He looks like David, but he has his mother's eyes. We talked for hours. I told him everything about David's double life, about the lies, about the deception. He listened quietly, his face a mask of emotions. He told me about his mother, who had died a few years ago. He said she'd always told him his father was a good man, that he loved him, but that he couldn't be with them for complicated reasons. It was another lie, a lie built on a foundation of deceit. I offered Michael a place in our family if he wanted it. I told him that Emily and Tom were his half-siblings, that they would welcome him with open arms. He was hesitant at first. He'd been hurt too many times, but he agreed to meet them. The meeting was tentative, awkward, but also hopeful. They found common ground, shared interests. They started to build a connection, a fragile bond based on shared blood and shared loss. Michael hasn't decided if he wants to be a part of our lives fully. He needs time, space to process everything. And I understand that. As for me, I'm finally starting to heal. The wounds are still there, but they're not as raw, not as painful. I'm focusing on my children, on my career, on my relationship with Sarah. I'm building a new life, a life based on honesty, trust, and genuine connection. I've learned that life is messy, complicated, and unpredictable. I've learned that people are capable of great cruelty, but also of great kindness. I've learned that forgiveness is a process, not an event. And I've learned that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a brighter future. This story is at its end. Thank you to all of you. That's all for this story. I'll be back with another one. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It motivates me to create more content like this.